It's breakfast. That's the difference. Thing is, this wasn't Doyle's first rodeo. Not even close. We'd caught him before, rattling the shed door like he thought we were hiding stolen goods, poking around the flower beds with a flashlight, jotting notes about invasive plants. Neighbors had stories too. He measured their lawns with rulers in the middle of the night. He told kids their bikes were unsightly hazards. He even stood on tiptoe to peek through windows, said he was checking for code compliance. The man was a menace, but to the HOA, he was just enthusiastic. That was Linda Clay's word for him, the HOA president. Every time Grandpa complained, she brushed it off with that fake smile of hers. Oh, Doyle just cares about the neighborhood. Cares? Please. Enthusiasm doesn't excuse trespassing, and the law sure didn't back him up either. North Carolina General Statute 14 to 159.13 made it clear stepping onto private property without consent was trespassing, but the sheriff's deputies called it a gray area. Unless we caught Doyle in the act and pressed charges immediately, it was just our word against his, and Doyle knew it. That's why he climbed fences like a cat burglar at dawn. He thought he was untouchable. But that morning, something changed. Grandpa didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't storm into the yard. He just sat there, coffee cooling.
When Karen knocked on my door with a
eyes narrowed
5,000...
like a hawk. When Doyle finally scuttled back over the fence, phone full of pictures, Grandpa stayed quiet for a long, long moment. Then he stood, stretched his back, and said 6 words that made the hairs on my neck stand up. It's time he learned his lesson. For the next 3 days, the garage became his workshop. Metal clinked, tools buzzed. I heard the low hum of drills, the occasional sharp curse, and always, the steady rhythm of old country songs humming from his lips. I played assistant, fetching wrenches, holding flashlights, handing him spools of wire. And every time I asked what he was building, he just grinned. You'll see soon enough. By the 4th day, the gate at the end of our driveway wasn't just a gate anymore. It was something new, something waiting. Thick wires ran clean along the frame, tucked neat like they'd always belonged there. A low-voltage electrical unit, legal under state code, hummed quietly behind the bushes. Perfectly legal, perfectly documented. And right there, nailed to the post in bold black letters on bright yellow plastic. High voltage warning, electrified gate. Trespassers will be shocked. High voltage. This wasn't Doyle's first trespass. Not even close. The man treated Maple Court like his own private investigation zone. And every one of us, every neighbor, every homeowner, was a suspect. We caught him rattling the lock on Grandpa's shed one morning, his scrawny fingers tugging at the handle like he expected contraband to tumble out. When Grandpa stepped outside, Doyle didn't even flinch. He just muttered something about unpermitted structures and scurried off like a rat caught in the pantry. Another time, I looked up from my homework and nearly jumped out of my skin. There he was, his pale face pressed against our living room window, his breath fogging the glass. He cupped his hands to block the glare, peering in like a burglar casing the place. When Grandpa asked him what in the world he thought he was doing, Doyle calmly claimed he was checking compliance. Compliance? For what? Curtains? And if that wasn't enough, there was a day we caught him crouched in the flower beds. Grandpa's petunias weren't contraband, but the way Doyle poked at the soil, scribbling notes in his clipboard, you'd think he'd just uncovered a crime scene. And it wasn't just us. Word spread across the street like wildfire. Old Mr. Harris swore Doyle had measured the cracks in his driveway with a tape measure, muttering something about hazard standards. Mrs. Nguyen said she woke at dawn to see Doyle crouched by her shrubs, flashlight beaming, scribbling again. Even the Johnson kids weren't safe. Doyle wagged his finger at them for leaving bikes near the sidewalk, calling them dangerous obstructions. To everyone else, Maple Court was a neighborhood. To Doyle Mason, it was his personal police beat. And here's where it got worse. Every complaint, every call, Every plea to the HOA fell flat, because at the center of it all was Linda Clay, HOA president, queen of polished pearls and plastered smiles. We'd sit at those HOA meetings, neighbors' voices rising, frustration spilling into the air. And Linda would lean back, hands folded, that fake warmth dripping from her voice. "Oh, Doyle's just enthusiastic," she'd say. Enthusiastic about keeping our community beautiful. Enthusiastic? That word drove Grandpa mad, because what Linda called enthusiasm, the rest of us called trespassing. It wasn't enthusiasm to rattle a 75-year-old veteran's shed door. It wasn't enthusiasm to snap photos of tomato plants like they were illegal crops. It wasn't enthusiasm to peek through windows at 6 in the morning. No, that wasn't enthusiasm. That was obsession. But Linda, Linda hid behind that word like it was armor. And as long as she smiled, Doyle had cover. We even called the sheriff's office once. Deputies showed up, listened, nodded their heads, even shook them in disbelief. And when Grandpa asked what could be done, one of them sighed. Unless you catch him in the act, unless you press charges on the spot, it's your word against his. A gray area, they called it, a gap in the law big enough for Doyle to crawl right through. And the worst part? Doyle knew it. That smug smirk he wore whenever Grandpa confronted him, that wasn't confidence. That was the look of a man who believed he was untouchable. The HOA had his back. The law shrugged its shoulders, and we were left with a prowler in our yard, free to do it again and again. But see, Grandpa wasn't like me. I wanted to storm out there, to shout, to shove the phone out of Doyle's hand and tell him to never come back. But Grandpa, he was steady, measured, the kind of man who believed patience was sharper than anger and silence louder than shouting. Let a fool talk long enough, he always said, and he'll trip over his own tongue. Let a fool act long enough, and he'll dig his own grave. So when Doyle trespassed again, rattling the shed, poking of flower beds, snapping pictures of tomatoes, Grandpa didn't explode. He didn't shout. He didn't even raise his voice. Instead, he sat on that porch, sipping his coffee, eyes narrowed like a hawk tracking prey. And then he stood, slowly, calmly. "It's time," he muttered, more to himself than to me. Time he learned a lesson. That's when Grandpa disappeared into the garage. For 3 days, the air rang with the sounds of tinkering. Metal clinking, drills buzzing, saw blades whining. The smell of oil, solder, and burnt rubber drifted through the yard. Every now and then, I'd hear him humming. Old country tunes, low and steady, echoing beneath the garage rafters. Tunes that told me he wasn't angry, he was focused. And that was worse. Much worse. I played assistant, fetching him tools when he asked, holding flashlights when his hands were full, watching as he pieced together something I couldn't quite understand. "Grandpa," I asked more than once, "what are you building?" Each time, he gave the same answer. "You'll see." By the 4th day, it was ready. Our iron gate, the one at the end of the driveway, didn't just creak on its hinges anymore. It hummed. Neat wires, fastened clean along the frame, connected to a low-voltage electrical unit, mounted discreetly behind the bushes. Nothing sloppy. Nothing makeshift. This was precise. Legal. Safe, but not for Doyle Mason. And Grandpa had made sure it followed every rule in the book. A laminated permit tucked neatly into a folder. Paperwork signed and stamped. Everything filed exactly as it should be. And then, just to drive the point home, he nailed a bright yellow sign to the post. Warning. Electrified gate. Trespassers will be shocked. That night, Grandpa sat back in his rocker, thermos of coffee steaming beside him. The hum of the gate buzzed faintly in the quiet air. He leaned back, eyes fixed on the street, like a hunter waiting for the trap to spring. I stood behind him, restless, pacing. "Are you sure about this?" I whispered. He didn't even look at me. "Son," he said, calm as the night sky, "patience mixed with planning is the sharpest weapon a man can wield." The chair creaked beneath his weight. The gate hummed in the shadows. And all we had to do was wait. The morning Doyle returned, the neighborhood woke to more than birdsong. The sky was just starting to pale with that pinkish hue. the kind that makes the streetlights flicker off one by one. Our yard was still soaked in dew, the air sharp and cool. Grandpa was already on the porch, rocking slow, thermos in his hand like always. He looked like a man who had nothing but time. Me? I was crouched low by the window, heart pounding hard enough I swore Doyle could hear it through the fence. Then came the sound, gravel crunching under boots. The rhythm of someone moving with purpose, but not caution. That's how Doyle walked, like the world was his front yard and he owned every blade of grass on it. His silhouette came into view, scrawny frame outlined against a faint morning light, clipboard under his arm, phone in hand, that same smug tilt his chin as if today he'd finally catch us red-handed. But what Doyle didn't know was that today wasn't going to be like the others. He reached the gate and muttered something about violations. I couldn't hear the words exactly, but I knew the tone, the way he always said it, like he was judge and jury rolled into one. He leaned in, glove-covered hand wrapping around the iron bar. And then it happened. Snap! A jolt ran through him so fast his whole body stiffened like a wooden board. His knees buckled, his arms flailed, and a strangled yelp tore from his throat. The sound wasn't just a shout. It was a sharp cry of a man who realized, in one blinding second, that he wasn't untouchable after all. He stumbled backward, boots skidding across the gravel, until he landed square in the dirt. For a moment, he just sat there, stunned, blinking like someone had poured a bucket of ice water over his head. Then, with a groan, he scrambled to his feet, brushing at his clothes like the mud was somehow to blame. Neighbors had started peeking out from curtains and cracked open doors. One by one, faces appeared half-hidden, eyes wide. Mrs. Nguyen, coffee mug in hand, froze on her porch steps. Mr. Harris leaned against his mailbox, lips twitching as if he couldn't decide whether to laugh. Even the Johnson kids pressed their faces to their upstairs window, giggling behind their hands. Doyle tried to straighten himself up, but there was no hiding it. His shirt was rumpled, his pants smeared with dirt, and his expression, his expression was priceless. Red-faced, eyes wide, humiliated, and through it all, Grandpa didn't move a muscle. He rocked once, twice, brought his thermos to his lips, took a long sip like he'd been waiting for this exact moment all week. And then, in that gravelly voice of his, he muttered just loud enough for me to hear. That was the sound of justice. I nearly choked on my own breath. Doyle staggered off, limping slightly, muttering under his breath about lawsuits and violations. He cast one last glare at the gate, but didn't dare touch it again. He disappeared down the sidewalk, tried to regain his dignity, but there was no saving it. By noon, the whole street was buzzing. Word spread faster than wildfire. Maple Court was alive with whispers and chuckles. You couldn't step outside without catching pieces of the story. Did you hear? Doyle got himself zapped. Serve him right. Finally, some were half-shocked, their voices lowered as if afraid Doyle might still be lurking. Others couldn't hide their amusement, smiling openly at the thought of the so-called HOA patrol being taken down a peg. Even kids on bikes zipped past, mimicking an exaggerated jolt with their arms flailing like puppets. Doyle, of course, wasn't about to let it go quietly. He limped around the neighborhood, arms stiff, claiming Grandpa had built a death trap. He told anyone who'd listened that it was dangerous, illegal, a menace to the community. He showed off a tiny red welt on his wrist like it was a battle scar from the front lines. He painted himself as the victim, the brave guardian of neighborhood standards, nearly killed in the line of duty. But the neighbors weren't buying it. Not this time. Everyone had seen Doyle's antics, his late-night snooping, his endless photographs, his measuring tape clicking in the dead of night. Everyone had a story of him sticking his nose where it didn't belong. And deep down they knew what happened wasn't a trap. It wasn't an accident. It was justice, plain and simple. Still, Doyle strutted on, trying to spin his tail. He waved his clipboard around like it was proof of authority. He pointed at Grandpa's yard with dramatic flair, claiming that the old man was a danger to the entire neighborhood. But the looks he got in return weren't sympathy. They were smirks, eye rolls, and the occasional stifled laugh. Because here's the thing about justice. It doesn't always come with a gavel or a badge. Sometimes it comes with a little electricity and a man too stubborn to see it coming. That night, I sat on the porch with Grandpa, the hum of the gate faint in the background. The air was cool, filled with the quiet rustle of leaves. I couldn't stop grinning, replaying the image of Doyle's arms flailing, his yelp echoing down the street. "Think he'll come back?" I asked. Grandpa leaned back, staring out into the dark. His eyes, steady and calm, glinted in the porch light. "Oh, he'll be back," he said, sipping from his thermos. Men like him don't learn from pain. They only learn when the world finally shows them they're not in charge. And he was right, because for Doyle Mason, one shock wasn't going to be enough. He wasn't just a trespasser. He was obsessed. And obsessed men don't walk away from humiliation. They double down. They come back, even when every sign tells them to stay away. But for now, the street was calm. The neighbors had their gossip. Doyle had his limp. And Grandpa had his victory. Sometimes justice is loud and messy. Sometimes it's a courtroom or a police report. But that morning, justice was the sound of electricity snapping through iron, echoing across Maple Court, and silencing the self-appointed patrol, if only for a little while. They called it an emergency HOA meeting, which really just meant they wanted the drama while the gossip was still hot. By 6 that evening, the clubhouse at the end of Maple Court was lit up like a stage. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Folding chairs scraped across the linoleum, and someone had set out a tray of store-bought cookies like sugar could sweeten what was coming. Doyle arrived first, of course he did, his right arm wrapped in a sling far too big for the job. He wore like a badge, chin high, the picture of wounded authority. He paced in front of the long conference table and pointed before he even sat down. "This man endangers a community with an electrified weapon," he announced, stabbing a finger at Grandpa as we walked in. Half the room jumped. The other half rolled their eyes. Grandpa didn't speed up, didn't slow down either. He took the aisle like a man taking his usual seat on a Sunday train, hat tipped slightly, steps even, thermos tucked under his elbow. He chose a chair 3 rows back and lowered himself with a soft creak, the kind of sound that said he'd been sitting in chairs like this his whole life. I sat beside him, feeling the room throb with whispers. At the head of the table sat Linda Clay, all pearls and posture, palms flattened against a neat stack of papers. To her left were the other board members, Todd with the too-tight tie, Marianne, who always looked like she smelled something sour, and Greg, who never spoke unless someone told him to. Linda offered a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We're here," she said, voice syrupy, "to discuss a serious safety matter." "Attempted murder," Doyle added loudly. A few people snorted. One of the Johnson kids, sitting on the back row with her mom, muffled a giggle behind her hand. Linda rapped the gavel. "Doyle." He lifted his sling a touch higher, as if to remind us. "I was performing an inspection." "Inspection?" someone muttered near the door. "At sunrise." "And I was violently shocked by an illegally electrified fence," he continued, ignoring the peanut gallery. "This resident has installed a hazardous device." Grandpa's thermos cap clicked softly as he unscrewed it. He poured coffee into the lid, like this was any other evening on the porch and not a trial by neighbor. When he finally stood, he didn't look at Doyle. He looked at Linda, and then, with the same calm he used to read morning headlines, he slid a laminated sheet across the aisle to the front table. Todd sprang from his chair to grab it like it might explode. "That," Grandpa said, "is a permit. Low voltage. Compliant under the code. Installation inspected last Thursday. Warning signage posted in plain sight." Todd stared at the paper, mouth moving as he read. Greg leaned over his shoulder. Marianne pinched her lips and reached for the hand sanitizer like the permit might be contagious. Linda smiled harder. "Even if this is technically allowable, Mr. Thompson, it's aggressive. We prefer a spirit of harmony." People felt threatened. Grandpa nodded once. "So did I." "By what?" Doyle barked. "Tomatoes." A soft laugh rippled across the room. Grandpa didn't take the bait. He set the thermos lid down on the chair seat, then folded both hands over the top of it. "Mrs. Clay," he said, voice low and steady. "3 times this man entered my yard without permission. Once at the shed, twice over the fence. I reported each instance. You dismissed each as, what was the word? Enthusiasm, someone in the back supplied. Enthusiasm, Grandpa repeated. I posted warnings. I called the sheriff. I asked your board to intervene. I did not escalate. I documented. And I installed a lawful deterrent with clear signage. Next time he trespasses, I will press charges. That's all I have. He sat. Nothing dramatic. No flourish. Just a clean end to a carefully drawn line. For a heartbeat, the room hung there, suspended. Then it shifted, so faint you could miss it if you weren't watching. People turned not toward Doyle, but toward each other. There's a kind of courage that moves like a breeze, invisible until you feel its hand on your shoulder. It started with a small woman near the wall, gray cardigan, soft hands fidgeting with a bracelet. He came into my backyard, she said, voice shaking at first, then steadying. I thought I was the only one. He measured my shrubs, told me the variety was non-compliant. I didn't even know what that meant. Two rows up, a man with paint on his cuticles lifted his chin. He took pictures of my kids' bikes, called them an eyesore. My boys are 6 and 8. Heads turned, faces tightened. The Johnson mom raised a hand next. He circled our block 2 nights in a row after 10, parked with the lights off, said he was observing patterns. My daughter wouldn't go outside. Now the stories came faster, a staccato line of small humiliations, a tape measure clicking in the dark, flashbulbs through blinds, notes tucked on doors like citations from a court that didn't exist. Each testimony bent the floorboards a little. Doyle's face went the color of raw meat. That is all hearsay, he snapped. I am authorized to conduct assessments on behalf of the... You're not authorized, Todd blurted, still staring at the permit as if it had rearranged his understanding of the world. We don't have a field inspector role, at least not formally. Marianne cleared her throat. We have neighborhood standards. We encourage vigilance. Vigilance isn't midnight with a flashlight, Mr. Harris said from the doorway. He'd come in late, leaning on his cane. Vigilance isn't scaring children, and it sure ain't rattling doors that don't belong to you. Linda picked up the gavel, then put it down. The pearls at her throat looked suddenly heavy. She tried for her smile again and came up short. Let's maintain decorum, she said, but even her own board wasn't looking at her anymore. They were looking at the neighbors, at the stories, at Doyle. Doyle took a step forward, and the sling bounced like a prop. This is a witch hunt. The real issue is the weaponized fence. The real issue, Grandpa said, not rising this time, not even raising his voice, is trespass. It was quiet enough to hear the air conditioner kick on. Someone coughed. The Johnson kid stifled another laugh and failed. Linda's eyes flicked to the permit again, like it might offer a way out. We can certainly review the aesthetic impact of the installation, she offered weakly. Grandpa turned his palm up. Regulate aesthetics. That's your lane. The law is mine. From the back corner, a tall woman with paint-spattered jeans lifted her phone. I've got footage, she said. 2 nights ago. He walked right up my driveway, filmed through the car window, then moved to the side yard. At 11:42 p.m., she held the screen up. A few people gasped softly at the glow. Doyle's mouth opened and closed. He switched tracks. I was responding to reports. People come to me because the board won't act. Linda flinched at that. We have processes, Doyle. Your processes are slow, he snapped. Standards decay when no one enforces them. Standards, Mr. Harris said, tapping his cane once, aren't worth a nickel if you throw neighborly decency into the ditch to get them. It should have been small, that tap of the cane. It sounded like a gavel. Eyes went to Grandpa. He didn't bask. He didn't smirk. He just lifted the thermos lid, took a quiet sip, and looked content to let the room write its own ending. Finally, Linda squared the papers that didn't need squaring and tried to find the voice she'd practiced in the mirror. Given the information shared, the board will form a committee to review boundary concerns, clarify access policies, and... No committees, Marion said, surprising everyone, including herself. This is simple. No one enters private property without permission. Full stop. Todd nodded slowly. And we should issue guidance about after dark observation. He looked at Doyle and then down again. As in, don't. Greg cleared his throat for perhaps the first time all year. And we should apologize. The word hovered there like a bird testing the air. Apologize. To whom? To everyone, maybe. Doyle's ears burned. You're all missing the point. That old man. Enough, Linda said, and for once the word had spine. She turned to Grandpa. Mr. Thompson, we acknowledge your permit and signage are in order. We ask that you, consider the visual impact of your deterrent, but we recognize your right to protect your property. We will draft and publish a policy clarifying that no board member or resident may enter private property for inspection without explicit consent. Period. A murmur swelled. Relief, maybe, or the first breath after holding it too long. Chairs squeaked. People leaned back like some weight had let go of their shoulders. Grandpa dipped his head. Nothing grand, just a nod that said he'd expected nothing more and would accept nothing less. He stood, slid the thermos under his arm, and turned toward the aisle. Doyle lunged half a step. Sling and all, this is a miscarriage. He's dangerous. That device. Grandpa paused just long enough to look at him, not with anger, not with triumph, with a kind of tired kindness that carried more force than any word. Don't touch my gate, he said. No thunder, no lightning, just a gentle grind of chair legs and a soft thump of feet as neighbors stood to leave, some stopping by Grandpa to squeeze his shoulder, some whispering thanks, some walking past Doyle without seeing him at all. By the time we reached the door, the sky outside had gone the color of cooling iron. Porch lights blinked on across Maple Court, one after another, like a row of sentries. Behind us, the gavel finally came down. 3 quick strikes that sounded smaller than Mr. Harris's cane. On the steps, I asked what he thought would happen next. Grandpa tightened the thermos cap and tucked it into his coat pocket. Men who build their authority on fear don't lose it gracefully, he said. But it's not his room anymore. When we crossed our yard, the faint hum from the gate met us like a familiar tune. The yellow warning sign gleamed softly in the porch light. Through the window blinds, I could see curtains twitch on our street. People settling back into their ordinary evenings with something like peace. Somebody laughed, far off. Not cruel, just relieved. And for the first time in a long time, Maple Court sounded like a neighborhood again. Midnight changes the way a street sounds. Maple Court, usually a place of sprinklers and kids on scooters, turned into a hollow tunnel of crickets and distant highway hum. Porch lights were off, curtains shut, houses crouched in silhouettes. The only glow came from the soft square of our front window and the pale, patient moon. Grandpa sat in his rocker like a lighthouse keeper, the faintest blue from the TV flickering through the screen door behind him. He had the remote in one hand and his thermos on the table, steam curling up like a secret. He looked as if he'd been carved there, steady, unmovable, the man who waits because he knows what's coming. At first, I thought the noise was a raccoon in the trash. A dry rustle, a dull clink, a pause. Then the beam of a flashlight wavered across the post of the gate and landed on the yellow sign, bright as a warning star. The beam held. The silhouette halted. Then the light dipped, searching. Bolt cutters gleamed when they caught the moon, a clean, predatory shine. The figure's shoulders hunched, and I didn't need to see his face to know the shape of his stubbornness. Doyle was back. He didn't slink. He moved like a man narrating his own heroism, a little louder in his breath than he needed to be. The clicks of metal on metal performed to an invisible audience. He crouched, tested a link with his gloved thumb, then stood and set the jaws of the cutter against the iron like the act itself would rewrite the law. I felt my chest tighten, a thin wire drawn through me. I glanced at Grandpa. He didn't look at me. He looked at the gate with the same quiet attention he'd give to a weather forecast he already knew by heart. The remote nestled in his palm like a promise. "Watch this," he said so softly the night almost swallowed it. The flashlight circle shook once as Doyle adjusted his grip and committed. Metal teeth bit iron. Zap! It wasn't loud, not like a movie. It was a crack and a bite, a single bright spit of blue where steel met charged steel. Doyle jerked like someone had yanked a rug out from under his bones. The cutters clanged against the post and fell into the mud with a weighty thud. He stumbled backward, legs tangling, one boot skidding on the wet grass until he sat down hard, palms slapping the ground. A hiss of breath left him, then a strangled sound that wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite a word. More the sound a man makes when the story he told about himself breaks in his hands. He scrambled, grabbed for the flashlight. It rolled, beam spinning over the yard like a panicked searchlight, and he found his feet by orbiting the chaos. Mud smeared his knees, a streak of it across his shirt. He looked down at the gate as if it had insulted him personally. Then he did what cowards do when they find out pain has rules. He reached to the nearest stage. He pulled out his phone and jabbed at the screen with frantic certainty. "Attempted murder," he shouted the moment the call took. "He's trying to kill me with a booby-trap fence. Send someone now." Grandpa didn't stand. He didn't even uncross his ankles. He set the remote on the table and lifted the thermos lid. The steam smelled like black coffee, clean and bitter, a midnight sermon. From a window, I saw the way his mouth almost smiled, not happy, not cruel. Something like inevitable. The sirens came slower than Doyle's panic made in his head, but quicker than most nights see. Red and blue washed over the street in tidal pulses. The neighborhood stirred. The practice lifted blinds by 2 inches, the soft creak of a door chain. Silhouettes arriving on porches with arms folded into bathrobes. The cruiser rolled to a stop in front of our yard, a second one idle behind it. 2 deputies stepped out, their voices calm in that trained way you can feel in your bones. The shorter one took the sign, the gate, the glistening bolt cutters in the mud. The taller's eyes moved from the warning placard to the porch. To Grandpa, the Doyle's clothes in hands. "Evening," the taller one said. "Attempted murder." Doyle repeated, "Not evening at all." He waved the phone. He electrified his property to injure me. It is a lethal device. I demand you arrest. The shorter deputy held up a hand. "Sir, take a breath." Grandpa finally rose. He did like he always did, slow, careful, a courtesy to old knees and anyone watching. He picked up a plastic sleeve from the porch table, the laminated permit catching the cruiser lights, and throwing them back pale and official. In his other hand, he held his phone, already cued to a video thumbnail that showed a man and a pair of bolt cutters lit by a tight white circle. The taller deputy met him halfway. "You the homeowner?" "Robert Thompson," Grandpa said. "Permits current. Low voltage, signage posted. Video is time-stamped." The deputy took the sleeve, scanned the top, flipped to the line that mattered, then looked at the sign on the post again. He nodded once. "You said video?" Grandpa tapped play and turned the screen. It was all there, crisp and unflattering. Doyle stepping into frame with the entitlement of a man who's never been told no, the bolt cutters rising, the caption at the bottom marking time, the sign in the corner declaring the warning any child could read, the spark, the drop, the scramble, Doyle's voice on his own phone, pitching the theater. The deputies didn't trade glances. They didn't need to. The shorter one turned to Doyle. "Sir, did you enter this property without the owner's consent?" "I was conducting an inspection for the HOA," Doyle said, recovering his clipped certainty. "There have been repeated violations here, and I was—" The deputy's eyebrow tilted. "At midnight? With bolt cutters." Silence found a chair in the yard and sat with us. "Sir," the tall one said, and there was no anger in it, only firm ground. "You're under arrest for criminal trespass, vandalism, and filing a false police report." He took Doyle's wrist, turned him neatly, and the cuffs sang their simple song. The flashlight beam quivered over the grass, as if trying to find a different ending for him and failing. The sound that rose then didn't creep. It swelled, clapping. Not sarcastic, not angry, relieved. Palms meeting in praise of boundaries restaked, of night made ordinary again. Mrs. Nguyen stood at the edge of her steps and clapped with her mug still in her hand. Mr. Harris, in a bathrobe and slippers, tapped his cane in rhythm. The Johnson kids' faces glowed in their upstairs window, like two small moons. Doyle shouted over it. "You don't understand. He's armed his house. He'll hurt someone." The words bounced off something that wasn't a wall. It was the absence of attention, the slow turn of a street away from a man who had lived on their nerves for too long. Grandpa didn't address him. He sat back down and let the rocker find its groove again. The thermos lid was warm in his palm, and he breathed the steam like a man who'd come through a winter to find his porch still his. The shorter deputy picked up the cutters with 2 fingers and dropped them into an evidence bag, the plastic crackling as it closed. "We'll need copies of that video, sir." "I'll airdrop it," I said, and realized my hands weren't shaking anymore. The taller deputy handed back the permit. "Careful not to smudge it. Everything looks in order on your end. We'll note the signage in our report." Grandpa nodded. "Appreciate you, officers." Need for Control was bright and posted and true. Across the street, a door opened wider. More neighbors drifted to their porches, gathering into that loose, late-night congregation only small streets know. The applause faded into murmurs, some laughter, relief loosening shoulders you could see even in the dark. A dog barked twice, and then remembered the hour. They guided Doyle to the cruiser. He tried one last glare at the gate, but glare is a weak tool when the world has seen you with a pair of bolt cutters in your hand and your story turned inside out. The back door closed with that padded thunk, and the light spun once like a slow exhale. "Sometimes," Grandpa said, and his voice was more tired than triumphant, more human than hard, "justice just needs a little electricity." He didn't wink. He didn't look for anyone to write it down. He lifted the cup to his lips and let the night be the witness. When the cars rolled away, the quiet didn't feel nervous anymore. It felt earned. Neighbors drifted back into houses, the way you do after fireworks. Still talking, still smiling, carrying the last sparks with them. The gate hummed its small, steady hum, the sign's yellow square catching the porch light, like a beacon for common sense. We stepped inside, and the house took us back with the soft clicks and sighs of an old friend settling into sleep. In the morning, the street would have stories. In the afternoon, the HOA would have minutes to write and words to choose carefully. But right then, Maple Court belonged to crickets and the cooling air and a front porch where a man could sit with his coffee and know the border between his life and another man's. Imagine serving your country overseas, putting your life on the line, only come home and discover your land, the very soil you fought to protect, was sold out from under you by a greedy homeowners association. That's exactly what happened to me. While I was deployed, risking everything in a hostile zone, the HOA back home saw an opportunity. They claimed I had abandoned my property, auctioned it off, and pocketed the profit. But what they didn't realize was that I had 2 powerful weapons they couldn't match: the law and the U.S. military. When I landed stateside, I went straight to the county office. Paper trails don't lie. The so-called sale was riddled with fraud, fake notices, and illegal filings. The HOA thought they were untouchable because they had money, lawyers, and control over the neighborhood. What they didn't count on was my training, my discipline, and my brothers and sisters in arms. I didn't just sue them. I invoked a federal act protecting deployed service members from exactly this kind of predatory nonsense. And when the judge saw the evidence, the ruling was swift. The sale was void. But that was just the beginning. The HOA had overstepped so badly that the court granted me something almost unheard of: authority to repossess not just my land, but the entire subdivision built illegally on it. Picture this: an entire board of smug HOA bullies watching in horror as U.S. Marshals, backed by a military legal team, served them with eviction notices. The very houses they lorded over were no longer theirs. I didn't just win my land back. I reclaimed every brick, every sidewalk, every pool they thought they owned. That day, the HOA learned a lesson they'll never forget. When you steal from a soldier, you don't just face a man, you face an army. I was halfway across the world, deep in the heart of a combat zone, when the betrayal struck. Life overseas was a cocktail of adrenaline and discipline. Every day was the same rhythm: boots crunching against gravel under the desert sun, the metallic scent of oil and gunpowder, the constant awareness that a wrong move could be your last. Out there, the only things that mattered were survival, trust, and the mission. Home felt like a memory locked in another lifetime. My connection to it was reduced to letters that arrived weeks late, photographs folded into creases from travel, and the thought of the land my father left me. The one steady thing in a world of chaos. That land wasn't just acres of dirt. It was a promise. My father had worked it with his bare hands, sweating under the same sun that burned my face overseas. Before he passed, he told me, "Son, this land is your anchor. When the world feels like it's spinning out of control, this will always be yours." I carried those words with me through every mission, every sleepless night, every time mortar fire lit at the horizon. But while I was out there giving everything I had for my country, the very thing I was protecting was stolen from me. The Homeowners Association, those self-appointed tyrants in polo shirts and clipboards, filed paperwork claiming I had abandoned my property. They knew I was deployed. My military status wasn't secret. But that didn't stop them. They forged notices, manipulated deadlines, and made it look as if I had turned my back on the land. Then, without hesitation or shame, they sold it off. I had no voice, no warning, no chance to defend myself. By the time I was granted leave and boarded a flight back home, the deed was done. The first moment I drove down the familiar road, my heart nearly stopped. Where my open land once stretched, dotted with trees and the outline of my father's old workshop, rows of cookie-cutter houses stood lined up like soldiers of concrete. Vinyl siding, manicured lawns, and freshly painted mailboxes, all erected on top of my soil. My backyard was now their driveways. My inheritance was their subdivision. And there, standing on one of those porches, I saw them, the HOA board members, the ones who had orchestrated this theft. They were sipping coffee, waving to each other with smug smiles, like kings surveying their conquered kingdom. I stepped out of my truck and felt the weight of betrayal settle into my chest. My boots pressed in the ground that should have felt familiar, but instead it felt foreign, as if the earth itself had turned its back on me. The sting wasn't just personal. It was deeper, sharper. This wasn't about losing property. This wasn't about money. It felt like the very soil I had risked my life to protect had been ripped away from me. Every time I carried a rifle into battle, I thought of home. Every time I pulled a comrade out of danger, I thought of the promise of peace waiting for me. And now that peace had been sold like it was nothing more than a bargaining chip in some neighborhood power play. I clenched my fists, my pulse pounding in my ears. Anger surged, but beneath it was something worse, violation. The land was sacred to me, woven into my bloodline, my identity. And now it had been desecrated by people who valued profit and control over honor and sacrifice. As I walked closer, one of the board members noticed me. He was dressed in khakis and a button-up shirt, the kind of uniform for men who fought their battles in conference rooms. He looked at me with an expression that flickered between annoyance and condescension, as if I were some trespasser on his property. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone dripping with false politeness. I wanted to shout. I wanted to tell him this was mine, that every brick, every blade of grass under his polished shoes belonged to me. But I didn't. Years of training had taught me restraint. Instead, I just stared, letting silence carry the weight of what I felt. He smirked, dismissing me with a wave of his hand before turning back to his coffee. That moment seared into me like a brand. It wasn't just disrespect. It was mockery. These people thought they had beaten me, that I would just accept the loss and fade away. But they didn't understand who they were dealing with, because I wasn't just a man returning from war. I was a soldier trained to fight battles no one else dared to face. And if they thought I would surrender the one thing my father entrusted to me, they had another thing coming. That night, I sat in the empty shell of what used to be my father's workshop, staring at the ruins of the past. The wind whistled through broken beams, carrying with it memories of laughter, sweat, and hard work. I closed my eyes and made a promise, not just to myself, but to my father, to my family, to every comrade who never made it home. I would reclaim what was mine, and I wouldn't just take back the land. I would take down the empire they built on it. The HOA thought they had won a quiet victory, hidden behind paperwork and bureaucracy. They didn't realize that the man they stole from was the very same kind of man who doesn't give up, who doesn't break, who doesn't stop until justice is served. This wasn't just betrayal. This was war. And unlike them, I knew how to fight a war to the end. The morning after I returned, I drove into town with one mission on my mind: find the truth. I wasn't looking for a fight. Not yet. What I needed were answers, cold, hard facts that couldn't be denied, twisted, or buried. The place to find them was a county office, where the records sat stacked in dusty files and digital databases. Bureaucracy might move slowly, but it leaves a trail, and I was ready to follow it to the very end. Walking into that building, I felt the same sharp focus I had felt on patrols overseas. It wasn't combat, but it might as well have been. The stakes felt just as high. The polished tile floors echoed under my boots as I crossed the lobby, the hum of fluorescent lights above me buzzing like static in my ears. The smell of old paper and printer ink mixed with a faint aroma of stale coffee drifting from a corner desk. I gave my name to the clerk, explained I was there to review property records, and watched as her polite smile flickered with unease. It was subtle, barely a twitch, but I caught it. My instincts sharpened. Something was already off. Minutes later, I sat at a desk with a thick folder dropped in front of me. The clerk walked away quickly, almost too quickly, as if she didn't want to stick around to see what I was about to uncover. I opened the file, and the first page nearly stopped my heart. Notice of abandonment. Stamped across it was my name, my property address, and a claim that I had failed to respond to multiple letters. According to this document, I had relinquished all rights to the property, and the HOA had the authority to auction it. I frowned. Flipping to the back, there were signatures, mine, supposedly, scribbled in rush pen strokes. But they weren't mine, not even close. My real signature has a sharp angle on the A. A habit I picked up signing forms in the military. This one was smooth, rounded, almost lazy, a forgery, plain and simple. My blood ran cold, but I forced myself to breathe evenly. Rage wouldn't help me now. Precision would. I kept turning pages. The so-called auction notice was buried in a local classified section of a paper hardly anyone reads. The dates didn't line up. One deadline posted a week before the supposed notice even went public. It was sloppy but deliberate, a con job, executed by people who thought no one would check. I leaned closer, studying the stamps and seals. Some were smudged, inconsistent with official records. One page claimed to be notarized, but the notary's commission number was expired. My pulse quickened, but not from fear. From clarity. This wasn't just incompetence. This was organized fraud. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. There were fake, certified letters, allegedly sent to me at my address, each one stamped as undeliverable. Yet, I had mail forwarding through the military, and not a single one had ever reached me overseas. I knew because my commanding officer personally handled those logistics. Someone had lied. Someone had deliberately blocked communication. I flipped through timestamps, comparing dates to military deployment records I carried in my bag. Sure enough, every so-called failure to respond coincided with days I was halfway around the world dodging bullets. They counted on my absence. They exploited my service. I sat back in the chair, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me again. But this time it wasn't just anger, it was certainty. These people had built their theft on a house of lies, and I was holding the blueprint. I gathered every page, scanning it with my phone, labeling files with military precision. Document 1, forged signature. Document 2, expired notary. Document 3, invalid deadlines. Document 4, falsified mail. Each one a weapon in the war I was about to wage. My training had taught me to see patterns where others saw noise, to notice the detail in the shadows, the flaw in the armor. Here, the flaws weren't in camouflage or tactics. They were in ink, paper, and bureaucracy. And they were everywhere. The more I uncovered, the more I realized this was an accident. This was calculated. The HOA hadn't just made a mistake. They had conspired, orchestrated, and executed a fraud with the precision of a heist. They thought paperwork was their weapon. They didn't realize that paperwork was also their weakness. I remembered nights overseas, scanning intelligence reports by dim red lights, piecing together the enemy's moves from scraps of information. This felt the same. The documents in front of me weren't just evidence. They were enemy positions, weak points, vulnerabilities waiting to be exposed. By the time I left that office, my folder was thick, my phone full of scanned pages, my mind sharper than it had been in months. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the town in amber light. I stood on the steps of the county building, clutching the evidence to my chest. People walked by, unaware of the war that had just begun in the shadows of paperwork. To them, it was just another Tuesday evening. To me, it was the beginning of justice. For a moment, I closed my eyes and thought of my father, thought of the promise he made me swear to keep, thought of the soil that carried our history, now paved over by strangers who thought they could erase me with a few forged signatures. Not anymore. I had what I needed. Proof. Facts. Truth written in black ink, undeniable and damning. And I wasn't going to let it sit in a folder. No, this was the arsenal I needed to strike back. The HOA thought they had buried me under paperwork, but what they didn't realize was that they had armed me instead. And now, it was only a matter of time before I turned their own lies against them, piece by piece, page by page, until their entire house of cards collapsed. This wasn't just evidence. This was war intelligence. And I knew exactly how to use it. The HOA thought I was just one man, just another voice they could drown out with legal jargon and intimidation. They saw me as a returning soldier, weary from war, unprepared for the battlefield of paperwork and courtrooms. Easy to brush aside. They were wrong. What they hadn't counted on was the law itself standing beside me. Not just any law, but the Service Member Civil Relief Act, SCRA, a piece of legislation forged for moments exactly like this. It was designed to protect deployed soldiers from predatory schemes, from foreclosure sharks, from vultures circling while men and women were overseas defending the very freedoms those vultures abused. And in my case, it was a shield sharper than any sword. The more I read, the clearer it became, the HOA hadn't just broken rules. They had violated federal protections that courts treat with zero tolerance. My deployment, my orders, my status. They were ironclad evidence that the HOA had acted illegally. Still, I knew the battlefield had changed. Out there, I carried a rifle. Here, my weapon was knowledge. And just like in war, you don't fight alone. I reached out to the Judge Advocate General's JAG office. Within days, I had a team of military attorneys who had seen every dirty trick in the book. These weren't rookies. They were seasoned in defending service members against banks, landlords, and organizations that thought soldiers were easy prey. When they heard my story, their expressions hardened. They didn't see me as a case. They saw me as one of their own. For the first time since I set foot back home, I wasn't alone. We turned my folder of evidence into a weapon. Every page I had scanned, every timestamp I had logged, every forged signature I had spotted, it was all ammunition. The JAG team went to work like a strike force. They drafted filings, dissected every clause, and lined up every violation in black and white. The HOA had no idea what was coming. At first, they laughed. I could almost picture them in their boardroom, sipping coffee out of mugs that read, HOA Strong, dismissing me as a disgruntled veteran who didn't know how the system worked. They'd dealt with complaints before, brushed aside neighbors who challenged their authority, buried families in fines until they gave up. But I wasn't just a neighbor. I was a soldier. And now, I had the full weight of the U.S. military legal system standing behind me. The first subpoena hit their mailbox like a thunderclap, then another, and another. Suddenly, the smug grin started to falter. Their business as usual turned into frantic phone calls to lawyers. They tried to spin it, to argue it was all just procedure, just policy enforcement. But the documents told a different story, a story of deliberate fraud, forged signatures, false notices, and property theft while I was deployed. Every time their lawyers tried to push back, my team countered with precision. JAG attorneys are trained not just in law but in combat logic. They know how to anticipate, how to cut off escape routes, how to dismantle an opponent piece by piece. The HOA board members who once smirked from their porches now avoided eye contact when I drove through the neighborhood. They knew the tide was shifting. I'll never forget one moment in particular. I walked into the JAG office, uniform pressed, folder in hand, ready to go over the latest filings. One of the attorneys, a colonel with decades of service behind him, looked up from the stack of evidence and said, "Son, they don't stand a chance. Not against this." It wasn't flattery. It was certainty. We didn't just build a case. We built a fortress. Exhibits were lined up like artillery, each one hammering home a violation. Emails proving false communication. Certified letters that had never been delivered. Forged documents with handwriting so sloppy even a rookie analyst could see the fraud. And over all of it, the SCRA like a sledgehammer, making clear that their actions weren't just immoral, they were illegal at the federal level. The HOA's laughter turned into silence, silence into whispers, whispers into panic. I started noticing subtle changes. Board members who once strutted through the subdivision now kept their heads down. Cars that were always parked confidently in driveways now vanished when subpoenas were served. At night, the same people who mocked me now held hush meetings, lights burning late in houses they no longer had the right to feel secure in. Justice was closing in and they could feel it. Still, they tried one last desperate move. Their lawyers filed a motion to dismiss, claiming I had failed to act in a timely manner and that the sale was already final. It was a Hail Mary pass, thrown in desperation. We crushed it. The JAG team presented deployment orders, showing exactly where I was and why I couldn't have possibly responded. They cited case law where courts had overturned similar scams. They pointed out the expired notary stamps, the forged handwriting, the fabricated deadlines. It was a massacre, legal, clean, and devastating. And as I watched the HOA's defense unravel, I realized something important. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about every soldier who would ever worry about their home while they were deployed. Every family that had feared losing what they had while their loved one fought overseas. This case was bigger than one property. It was a warning shot to every predatory group that thought service members were easy targets. By the time the dust settled, the HOA no longer looked confident. They looked like what they truly were, bullies exposed in the harsh light of truth. The subpoenas kept coming. Depositions were scheduled. Board members squirmed under questioning. Their empire, once built on arrogance and intimidation, was crumbling under the weight of their own fraud. And me? I stood taller with every passing day, because I knew that the law, the truth, and an army of defenders stood with me. The HOA thought I was just one man, but in reality I was never alone. And soon, the courtroom would prove it. The day of judgment fell heavier than any deployment briefing I'd ever stood through. The courthouse loomed ahead, tall stone columns carved against the morning sky, its doors polished from decades of people pushing through them. Some hopeful, some broken, all waiting for justice. As I walked up those steps, dressed in my pressed indoor service uniform, my boots clicked like the drumbeat of war. I wasn't carrying a rifle, but the weight of my evidence folder felt just as powerful. The courtroom was already packed when I arrived. Rows of polished wooden benches creaked under the weight of neighbors, reporters, curious onlookers, and more than a few people who had been burned by HOAs in their own lives. The air buzzed with whispers, each one hushed when the doors opened. This wasn't just another property dispute. This was a spectacle. On the other side of the aisle, the HOA's lawyers made their entrance. Expensive suits, silk ties, the kind of smug expressions only money can buy. They strutted like men who thought they'd already won, each step heavy with arrogance. Behind them sat the board members themselves, shifting nervously, their once confident smiles cracking around the edges. When the judge entered, the room rose.
Today I'm going down
Sound
to show
gathered
you
echoes
about me
thunder
with
against
my
the
friends.
walls, commanding
Enjoy.
silence. My heart pounded, but not with fear, with
you?
anticipation. I had lived through firefights, IEDs, nights where the darkness itself felt like an enemy.
Hey, guess
Compared
what?
to that,
What?
this
You're
was a
ugly.
battlefield I was
what
ready for.
do you mean? Like you're
HOA
ugly. Where?
opened first.
Where exactly?
Their lead
like
lawyer
your
spoke
face
with a
and
slick
stuff.
confidence.
Oh,
Reading
thank
words meant to
goodness.
paint me as
Why?
careless, negligent, even reckless. According to them, I had abandoned the property, ignored notices, and left them no choice but to act.
At
They
least
spoke
I'm
of policy enforcement and community stability, painting their theft as civic duty. Their words flowed like poison honey, sweet to the uninformed ear but venomous at the core. But the venom didn't last long. My attorney, sharp, disciplined, and relentless, rose like a coordinated strike team. The lead JAG attorney, a colonel with steel in his voice, laid the first piece of evidence on the table, a forged signature. He held it up against my official records, comparing each stroke, each curve of pen.
Today
It wasn't
I'm
just
going
off.
down to...
It was laughably fake. The jury's heads tilted. The judge leaned forward. The HOA lawyer shifted in his chair. Then came the expired notary stamp. The colonel pointed to the dates, his voice slicing through the silence. This notary was no longer licensed when this document was signed. That makes this filing invalid. Not questionable, invalid. The judge's eyebrow arched. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Next came the so-called auction notice, published in a tiny classified, and no one could reasonably be expected to see. Worse, the timeline didn't match. The deadlines had been backdated, set before the notice even went to print. One by one, the pieces stacked like artillery fire. Certified letters that were never sent. Records doctored to make it look like I ignored them. Deployment orders showing I was overseas when they claimed I failed to respond. Each document, each exhibit, hit like another shell landing on the HOA's defenses. The HOA lawyers tried to object, tried to spin, but every attempt was smothered under the weight of evidence. They looked less like seasoned professionals and more like corner rats scrambling for a hole. I sat there, hands folded, jaw tight, watching them unravel. I didn't need to speak. The truth was speaking louder than I ever could. Finally, the colonel invoked the Service Member Civil Relief Act. His voice rang like a battle cry. Federal law prohibits any foreclosure, repossession, or property seizure against an active duty service member without a court order. Not only did this HOA fail to seek such an order, they actively falsified documents to bypass it. This is not a technical error. This is fraud. Silence. The kind of silence that feels like a hell breath before an explosion. The HOA lawyers had nothing left. Their smug confidence had evaporated, leaving only sweat glistening on their brows. The board members sat pale, fidgeting in their seats. Their empire of arrogance was crumbling in real time. The judge leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, his gaze sharp as steel. He scanned the evidence laid out before him, page after damning page. Then, with a slow exhale, he raised the gavel. When it came down, it wasn't just with striking wood. It was thunder rolling through the room. This court finds the sale of the plaintiff's property void. The judge declared, his voice echoing like a verdict from the heavens. Furthermore, it recognizes that the subdivision built upon said property is constructed on illegally acquired land. Full repossession is hereby granted the plaintiff. The words hung in the air like a lightning strike. For a moment, no one moved. Then the gallery erupted, gasps, whispers, even a few claps muffled by the bailiff's stern glare. The HOA board members looked as if the floor had been ripped from beneath them. One buried his face in his hands. Another muttered under his breath. Their lawyers shuffled papers with trembling hands, already calculating how much their clients had just lost. As for me, I sat still, letting the words sink in. Full repossession. Not just my land, but every inch of concrete, every cul-de-sac, every neatly trimmed lawn and cookie-cutter house. The entire empire they thought they controlled now legally belonged to me. It was more than victory. It was justice. When I stood, my uniform catching the light from the high windows, I felt the weight of every sacrifice I had made overseas, every moment of doubt and rage since I'd returned, lift off my shoulders. I hadn't just fought for myself. I had fought for something bigger, for the principle that soldiers shouldn't have to defend their homes from the very people they swore to protect. As I walked out of that courtroom, the sun outside felt brighter, the air cleaner. Reporters swarmed, neighbors stared, and whispers followed me down the steps. But I didn't stop. I didn't need applause. I already had what I came for. Justice. And for the first time since I stepped off that plane from deployment, I felt whole again. The final act unfolded like a movie, except this time, I wasn't watching. I was standing in the center of it. It was early morning when the convoy arrived. A line of government-issued vehicles rolled down the subdivision streets. tires crunching over pristine asphalt that had been poured on top of my land. U.S. Marshals stepped out first, their uniforms crisp, their presence commanding instant authority. Each one carried a thick stack of official documents, eviction notices, stamped and sealed, the kind of paperwork that could topple kings. Behind them came the military legal officers. They weren't carrying weapons, but their calm, steady presence was every bit as powerful. These were the men and women who had stood beside me in the courtroom, who had turned my evidence into a fortress. And now, they were here in person, to make sure justice was carried out without question. I stood just behind them, my own uniform pressed, boots planted firmly on the soil that had always been mine. It felt surreal, like reclaiming a battlefield after the dust of war had settled. Except here, the enemy wasn't armed soldiers. It was an HOA board whose arrogance had blinded them into thinking they could steal from a soldier and get away with it. The marshals began knocking on doors, their voices carrying across the quiet streets. Federal eviction notice. You have 24 hours to vacate. Some doors slammed shut in panic. Others creaked open slowly, revealing wide-eyed board members whose bravado had evaporated. The same people who once lorded over the neighborhood with fines and threats now shuffled forward with pale faces and trembling hands. One board member, the very same man who once smirked at me and waved me off like a trespasser, was escorted down his own driveway. He tried to argue at first, his voice rising, insisted it was all a misunderstanding. But the marshal held up the notice, calm and unwavering. Court order, full repossession. The man's words died in his throat. For the first time, he looked small. Neighbors peeked through curtains, their whispers buzzing like electricity. Some were shocked, others quietly delighted. For years, they lived under the HOA's thumb, paying fines for the color of their shutters, for grass an inch too high, for mailboxes not painted a proved shade of beige. Now, they watched the empire collapse in real time. I caught the eye of one elderly couple standing at the edge of their yard. The husband gave me the smallest of nods, a gesture that said what words couldn't: gratitude, respect, relief. As the marshals worked, I walked the perimeter of the subdivision. Each step felt heavier with memory. Here was where my father's workshop once stood, replaced by a cul-de-sac. There, the old oak tree where I used to sit as a kid, now buried under concrete. They had tried to erase my history with bulldozers and blueprints. But now, that history was mine again. The HOA board members were gathered near the entrance by midday, their faces a collage of defeat. Some were red with anger, others pale with fear. They muttered to each other, occasionally glancing at me with a mixture of contempt and something else, something that looked an awful lot like regret. The head marshal, a broad-shouldered man with a voice like gravel, turned to me and asked, "Would you like to do the honors?" I took the stack of final notices from his hand. The papers were thick, the weight of justice tangible between my fingers. One by one, I handed them out to the board members. Some refused to meet my eyes. Others glared, but their glares held no power anymore. Each page they took was a reminder that their reign was over. When the last notice was delivered, I stepped back and let out a slow breath. For months, I had carried anger like a weapon, sharp and burning. Now, standing on my soil with the empire of lies collapsing around me, that anger finally gave way to something else: peace. Neighbors began stepping outside, more boldly now, their curiosity outweighing their fear. A few clapped softly. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Children pointed at the marshals, asking their parents questions. The subdivision that once pulsed with the HOA's control now buzzed with the raw, unfiltered energy of freedom. I turned toward the board members one last time. They stood in a cluster, eviction papers in hand, their arrogance stripped bare. I spoke clearly, my voice steady and carrying across the street. This land was mine before you built on it. It will be mine long after you're gone. You thought you could take it because I was serving overseas. You were wrong. When you steal from a soldier, you don't just pick a fight with a man. You declare war on an army. And today you lost. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to pause. Then the marshals began their final sweep, taping notices to doors, logging every detail with precision. The subdivision, once a symbol of HOA dominance, now stood as a monument to their downfall. As the sun dipped lower, casting long golden shadows across the pavement, I walked back to the edge of the land. My boots sank slightly into the soil near what remained of my father's workshop foundation. I knelt, running my hand across the ground, feeling the earth between my fingers. It was rough, uneven, scarred, but it was real, and it was mine. Justice had been served. The empire they built on lies had crumbled under its weight, and I was left standing, not just as a soldier, but as a son, a landowner, a man who had fought for what was right and won. That day, the HOA learned a truth they would never forget. When you steal from a soldier, you don't just face one man. You face everyone who stands with him. And together, we are unstoppable. Imagine living in a neighborhood where every lawn looks like it was cut with a ruler, every driveway shines like it's been polished, and every mailbox stands in perfect formation. Order is the law of the land here, especially under the watchful eyes of our self-proclaimed HOA enforcer, Karen. But here's the twist. Sometimes, the people who scream the loudest about rules are the ones breaking the biggest ones of all. It started small. At first, I thought I was imagining things. A bill here, a package there. It wasn't showing up in my mailbox. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe the Postal Service had misplaced it. Mistakes happen, right? But then, a birthday card from my sister vanished into thin air. She swore she'd mailed it. And suddenly, I realized I wasn't the only one. Neighbors whispered about missing deliveries too. Bank statements, packages, care boxes, gone without a trace. At first, it was just gossip. No one had proof. But I couldn't ignore what I was seeing. Every time the mail truck left, Karen would appear like clockwork. She wasn't just picking up her own letters. She lingered. She peeked into boxes that weren't hers. She even made comments about keeping the neighborhood safe from junk mail and how some people don't deserve to leave packages lying around. That's when it hit me. She wasn't protecting the neighborhood. She was preying on it. Now here's where the story takes a turn. Mail theft isn't just a bad habit. It's not some petty HOA violation you can fine someone for. It's a federal crime. And once the suspicions piled up, I decided enough was enough. I called the post office. And that's when the real hammer came down. The postal inspector. If you've never heard of them, you're not alone. Most people don't realize the Postal Service has its own law enforcement arm. Federal agents who deal with crimes like mail theft, fraud, and identity scams. And when I told them what was happening in our quiet, rule-obsessed neighborhood, they didn't laugh. They took it seriously. Very seriously. They set up a sting. A decoy package, fitted with a tracker and a hidden dye pack, was placed in my mailbox. I was told to stay quiet, keep watching, and wait. The trap was set. And Karen? She couldn't resist. What happened next turned our perfect little community upside down. Because one afternoon, Karen finally reached into the wrong mailbox, pulled out the wrong package, and set off a chain of events that ended not with an HOA fine, but with her standing red-handed in front of the entire neighborhood, being confronted by federal agents. The woman who thought she was the law suddenly learned what real law enforcement looks like. It started small. The first thing I noticed was a missing credit card bill. Nothing dramatic, just a single envelope that never showed up in my mailbox. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it got lost in transit. Maybe it was one of those rare clerical errors the Postal Service occasionally makes. I paid the bill online and moved on, but then came the birthday card. My sister had mailed it from across the state, with a gift card tucked neatly inside. She even texted me when she sent it, "Keep an eye out, it should be there by Friday." But Friday came and went. So did Saturday. A week later, the card was nowhere to be found. My sister swore she'd sent it. I believed her, which meant somewhere between her mailbox and mine, it had vanished. That was when the pattern started to reveal itself. A bank statement went missing. Then a package from an online order I'd been tracking suddenly showed as delivered, but the box never appeared on my porch. Soon after, another envelope, this one containing tickets for a concert, disappeared into thin air. At first, I chalked it up to bad luck. Maybe the Postal Service was overwhelmed, Or maybe porch pirates had started targeting the neighborhood. But something felt off. It wasn't just me. During one of my evening walks, I overheard Mrs. Green, the same neighbor who always gossiped about everyone's business, complaining on the phone. Yes, another bill's gone missing. I don't know what's going on, but it's becoming a problem. Later, Mr. Lane grumbled while collecting his recycling bins. Ordered a new set of tools last week. Tracking says delivered, but I'll be damned if they ever showed up. Even the Johnson kids mentioned their grandmother's care package never arrived. The whole street seemed to be dealing with the same strange problem, missing mail. But here's the thing about our neighborhood. We're conditioned not to jump conclusions. The HOA has trained us to think in terms of mix-ups, clerical errors, simple misunderstandings. No one wants to be the one who points fingers. So, while whispers circulated, no one had any proof. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling something was wrong. One morning, I got up earlier than usual and stood at my window with a cup of coffee, watching the row of mailboxes down the street. The mail carrier, a friendly man named Tony, pulled up at 9 a.m. sharp, just as he always did. He filled each box, waved at me when he saw me watching, and drove away. 10 minutes later, I noticed movement. It wasn't unusual to see neighbors checking their mail right after delivery. But what caught my eye was Karen. Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, the woman who had once fined a neighbor for leaving a basketball hoop in their driveway overnight, the one who had argued about the aesthetic inconsistency of someone's garden gnome, the one who believed she'd been divinely appointed to enforce the most trivial of rules. She wasn't just collecting her own mail. She lingered. She bent slightly, glanced around, then fiddled with the mailbox next to hers. At the time, I thought maybe she was just being nosy, maybe pretending to tidy something up. But my gut told me otherwise. The next day, I tried again. I watched from behind my blinds as Tony came and went. 10 minutes later, Karen appeared once more. Same pattern. Check her box, linger, glance, fiddle. A seed of suspicion planted itself firmly in my mind. By the end of the week, I started experimenting. I purposely ordered a small package, something unimportant, just a set of cheap phone chargers. The tracking said it arrived. But when I went out to grab it, the mailbox was empty. That night, I lay in bed replaying the events. The missing letters, the vanished packages, the whispers from neighbors, and then Karen, always near the mailboxes, always lingering just a little too long. The pieces fit together uncomfortably well. Could Karen, the woman who obsessed over weeds and trash bins, really be stealing mail? It sounded ridiculous. But then again, what better disguise than to be the person everyone thinks is enforcing order? Who would suspect the enforcer of being the thief? I didn't have proof. Not yet. But the more I thought about it, the more convinced I became. And once the suspicion took root, it grew like ivy, wrapping around every interaction I'd ever had with her. The way she always claimed to know what was going on with everyone. The way she justified peering into people's yards. The way she once bragged about keeping the neighborhood safe by picking up unattended packages. That was when it clicked. She wasn't protecting the neighborhood. She was watching it, watching for opportunities, watching for things to take. I started talking to neighbors, carefully, not wanting to sound paranoid. Hey, you missing mail too? I'd ask casually. More often than not, the answer was yes. Bills, a package, even a birthday card. They'd say, shaking their heads. We were all dealing with it. And the only common factor? The mailboxes. I began to feel restless, frustrated, even a little angry. Losing a bill was one thing. Losing a sister's birthday card was another. But stealing mail, if that's what was happening, wasn't just petty. It was a federal crime. And for as long as I had lived in the neighborhood, Karen had been a permanent fixture of our daily lives. The human embodiment of the HOA handbook. She was a type of neighbor who treated every lawn, every driveway, and every trash bin as her personal responsibility. To her, order wasn't just a preference. It was a crusade. So when the missing mail became a common complaint, Karen was the first to offer her unsolicited wisdom. It's no wonder things go missing, she scoffed one morning during a neighborhood gathering. Have you seen the state of some people's mailboxes? Rusted, messy, packages stacked halfway out. It looks like chaos. She said the word chaos like it was a disease. And, as usual, she said it loud enough for everyone within 20 feet to hear. Her favorite target seemed to be the Johnson family. They had 3 kids, and between school supplies, toys, and grandma's frequent care packages, their mailbox was often full. Sometimes a small box or a padded envelope would sit at the base of the post until they got home from work. To Karen, this was an atrocity. "I've told them," she would mutter, hands on hips as she glared at their mailbox. Leaving mail like that is practically inviting theft. Someone should do something about it. At the time, no one questioned what she meant by someone should do something. Most neighbors had learned it was easier to nod and keep walking than to challenge her directly. But then her commentary grew more pointed. Messy mailboxes lower the entire neighborhood's image. She complained to me one afternoon, standing squarely in front of mine while I tried to unlock it. The HOA handbook is very clear about exterior standards. If people can't manage their mail properly, maybe it shouldn't be their responsibility. I froze at that. The way she said it, maybe it shouldn't be their responsibility, sent a chill down my spine. She wasn't just talking about appearances. She was talking about control. From then on, I started noticing how often she loitered near the mailboxes. Every day, she seemed to find an excuse. Sometimes she'd be walking her dog, though the dog was nowhere to be seen. Other times she carried her phone, snapping pictures of the row of boxes as though documenting evidence for a trial. Once, I saw her with rubber gloves, tugging at the edges of a box as if she were checking for safety. It all looked innocent enough at first glance. But when I pieced it together with the missing envelopes, the empty packages, and her constant commentary about unapproved mail clutter, the picture became darker. It wasn't that she hated messy mailboxes. It was that she had found a convenient excuse to snoop. I remember a conversation with Mrs. Green just a week earlier. "Karen told me my package looked suspicious," she said, rolling her eyes. "Suspicious. It was my vitamins." She said she thought it was junk and nearly removed it from me. Another neighbor, Mr. Lane, echoed the sentiment. She told me she saw an envelope sticking out my box and almost took it for safekeeping. Can you believe that? Each story followed the same pattern. Karen noticed, Karen complained, and Karen nearly took matters into her own hands. The more I thought about it, the more obvious it seemed. The mail wasn't disappearing because of porch pirates or postal mistakes. It was disappearing because Karen believed she was entitled to decide what belonged and what didn't, and she disguised it with language that made her sound righteous. It's about protecting the community. I'm keeping the neighborhood safe from junk. People need to take more responsibility, or someone else has to. The neighbors rolled their eyes, but no one pushed back. After all, confronting Karen often turned into a public spectacle, and most people valued their peace too much to spark her fury. But I couldn't let it go, not when I saw her pattern so clearly. One morning, I left for work later than usual and spotted her again at the mailbox row. She was hunched low, her visor shading her eyes, as she reached into a box that wasn't hers. She yanked her hand out quickly when she noticed me watching, clutching a crumpled flyer. "Just tidying up," she said, forcing a smile. You know how people leave junk mail everywhere. But the way she stuffed the flyer into her purse told another story. That was the moment I truly connected the dots. She wasn't just a nosy neighbor with too much time on her hands. She wasn't just someone obsessed with appearances. Karen was stealing, and not just stealing, she was justified to herself. In her mind, every package she took, every letter she pocketed, every envelope she intercepted wasn't theft. It was enforcement. She was protecting the neighborhood from mess, from clutter, from whatever excuse she needed to wrap around her guilty hands. But here's the problem with self-appointed enforcers. Once they believe they're above the rules, there's nothing they won't do. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. This wasn't just Karen being Karen anymore. This was theft. This was privacy invasion. This was a federal crime. And the saddest part? She probably thought she was untouchable. But I knew better. The Postal Service takes theft very seriously, and once Karen crossed that line, she wasn't just breaking HOA rules, she was breaking the law. And soon enough, she was going to find out the hard way that when you tamper with people's mail, you're not playing neighborhood cop anymore. You're playing with the feds. By the time the fifth piece of mail disappeared, my patience had worn thin. I could tolerate Karen's endless HOA rants about unapproved trash bins and unsightly holiday decorations. But the missing letters and packages? That was different. This wasn't about appearances anymore. This was theft, real, tangible theft. I drove to the local post office one morning, carrying a small folder where I documented every missing item. The dates, the expected deliveries, the ones that had shown as delivered on tracking but never made it to my box. I wasn't sure how seriously they'd take me, but I needed answers. When I explained the situation to the clerk at the counter, she gave me a look that told me I wasn't the first person to report this sort of problem. She leaned in slightly and lowered her voice. "You'll want to speak to the postal inspector," she said. "Mail theft isn't just a nuisance. It's federal." That word, federal, hung heavy in the air. Later that week, he arrived. The inspector wasn't what I expected. No flashy badge, no loud declarations, no dramatic entrance. He was calm, professional, almost understated. A man in his late 40s with sharp eyes and the kind of demeanor that told you he'd seen it all before. He introduced himself with a firm handshake and a simple, "I understand you've been having some issues with your mail." We sat at my kitchen table as I slid my folder toward him. He leafed through my notes methodically, nodding at each entry, occasionally jotting something down in his own notebook. When I mentioned Karen, his eyes narrowed just slightly, though he didn't comment right away. Finally, he closed the folder and looked at me directly. "You were right to call," he said. "Mail theft isn't just annoying, it's a serious federal crime. We're talking fines, jail time, and a record that doesn't go away. If someone in your neighborhood is stealing mail, they're not just being nosy, they're committing a felony." The word sent a small chill through me. Felony. I leaned in. "So what happens next?" He folded his hands together, calm as ever. We set up a sting. The plan was simple but ingenious. The inspector explained that they would place a decoy package in my mailbox. It would look perfectly ordinary on the outside, but inside it would contain two key features, a tiny tracking device and a die pack. The tracker would allow them to monitor its movement in real time, no matter where it went. The die pack, on the other hand, was the trap. The moment someone tampered with the package, say, opening it, the die would burst, staining their hands bright red, a mark that was impossible to hide. "It won't hurt them," the inspector assured me, "but it'll make it very obvious who touched what wasn't theirs." The brilliance of it made me smile. Karen wouldn't be able to spin this as protecting the neighborhood or tidying up clutter. If she took the bait, she'd be caught red-handed, literally. The inspector set everything in motion that afternoon. From a plain, unmarked car parked discreetly down the street, I watched as he placed the decoy package into my mailbox. It looked like any other delivery, a small, nondescript box, taped neatly, addressed to me. He returned to the car, laptop open, eyes glued to the tracker signal. "Now we wait," he said simply. And so we did. The neighborhood seemed quieter than usual that evening, though maybe that was just my nerves making the silence feel heavier. I sipped coffee on my porch, pretending to read, but really I was watching. Every time a curtain shifted or a neighbor strolled past, my heart jumped. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. Mrs. Green noticed the package and stopped me mid-walk. "Did you get something delivered? Better bring it inside quick. You know how things vanish around here." Her eyes flicked toward Karen's house as she spoke, and I knew she suspected the same thing I did. By the next morning, the tension had settled over the street like fog. The package remained in place, untouched, and everyone seemed to be watching it without saying so. Mr. Lane lingered by his trash bins longer than usual. Teenagers on bikes slowed as they passed, pointing discreetly. Even Karen herself walked by once, hands clasped behind her back, eyeing the box with thinly veiled interest. The inspector noticed it too. From his unmarked car, he watched her every move. "She's circling," he murmured. "They usually can't resist." He was right. By the afternoon, Karen's comments started slipping out. To Mrs. Green, "That package has been sitting there all day. Isn't it unsafe?" To Mr. Lane, "If people can't take care of their deliveries, maybe someone else should." To me, directly, "You really ought to bring that inside before someone decides it doesn't belong." Her voice was sweet, but her eyes were sharp. She was itching to act. The inspector remained patient. He explained that sting operations required timing and restraint. "She has to incriminate herself," he said. "We can't move too soon." So the package sat there, waiting, a silent trap disguised as ordinary mail, and the whole neighborhood, whether they knew it or not, was holding its breath. The trap was set, and the entire street seemed to know it, though most had no idea just how elaborate it was. The decoy package sat snugly inside my mailbox, looking perfectly ordinary. To anyone passing by, it was just another delivery, the kind that appeared and disappeared countless times each week. But beneath that plain brown cardboard, a silent storm waited to erupt. All it needed was Karen's touch. Late that afternoon, the air hung heavy and still, as though the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. The inspector, parked discreetly in his unmarked black car, had been watching all day. His laptop glowed faintly, displaying a live signal from the tracker embedded inside the box. Every so often, he'd glance up at the mailboxes, patient and unflinching. I tried to look casual on my porch, sipping iced tea and pretending to scroll through my phone, though my heart thudded in my chest with every passing shadow. And then she appeared. Karen stepped out her house with her usual brisk determination, visor pulled low, pastel cardigan buttoned tight despite the heat. Her stride was sharp, her eyes darting left and right as she made her way down the sidewalk toward the row of mailboxes. She didn't head straight for her own. Instead, she lingered, just like she always did. She bent slightly, pretending to adjust her sandal, but her gaze locked firmly on mine. The package. My throat tightened. This was it. Karen straightened and cast a quick glance around the cul-de-sac. Most neighbors were indoors, though I spotted Mrs. Green's curtains twitch and 2 kids on bikes slowing near the corner. Karen smoothed her cardigan, took a deep breath, and stepped closer to my mailbox. Her hand hesitated on the latch for a moment, as if she were rehearsing her excuse should anyone confront her. Then, with a flick of her wrist, she pulled it open. The package sat inside, waiting. She looked both ways again, then reached in and slid it out with surprising speed, tucking it under her arm. She shut the mailbox and began walking briskly back toward her house, head lowered like a thief who didn't want to be seen. That was when it happened. The package hissed faintly, then pop. A small controlled burst erupted from within, releasing a brilliant cloud of red dye that sprayed across Karen's hands and wrists. She shrieked, stumbling backward, dropping the box in shock. Her fingers were stained crimson, the color seeping deep into the creases of her skin. No amount of scrubbing would remove it any time soon. The neighborhood came alive in gasps. Curtains flew open. Doors creaked. Mrs. Green let out a dramatic, "Oh, my heavens!" The kids on their bikes laughed and shouted, "She's busted! Look at her hands!" Karen panicked, shaking her arms as if she could fling the color away, but it clung stubbornly, marking her unmistakably guilty. She turned in frantic circles, muttering excuses no one could understand, when the inspector's car door slammed. Out stepped the postal inspector, calm as ever, but now flanked by 2 uniformed officers. Their presence was commanding, their voices firm. "Ma'am," the inspector called out, striding toward her. "Step away from the package." Karen froze, eyes wide with terror. "What?" "No, this is what it looks like. I was just cleaning up. It was clutter in the mailbox." "Tamper with the mail is a federal offense," the inspector said evenly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You've just been caught in the act." The officers closed in, one gently guiding her away from the dropped package, the other slipping on gloves to secure it safely. Karen sputtered, her voice rising in a desperate pitch. "No, you don't understand. I was protecting the neighborhood. People leave unsafe things in their boxes all the time. I was doing my duty. The inspector's gaze was steady, almost pitying. Your duty just earned you a federal charge. Mail theft is not an HOA matter. It's a crime punishable by law. The neighbors were pouring out now, forming a loose circle around the spectacle. Some whispered furiously. Others filmed openly with their phones. Mrs. Green clutched her poodle, eyes wide, as she whispered anyone who'd listen, "I knew it. I always said she was up to no good." Mr. Lane shook his head in disbelief. All that talk about community standards, and this is what she was doing behind our backs. Karen's face burned red, not just from the dye, but from the humiliation. Her hands, stained like evidence, trembled as she tried one last desperate plea. "This isn't fair. I was enforcing the rules. The HOA gives me authority. The HOA doesn't override federal law." The inspector cut in sharply. "And the rules don't grant you permission to steal your neighbor's property." The finality in his words silenced even her. The officers gently but firmly escorted her toward the inspector's vehicle. She looked small, diminished, no longer the towering figure who had once lorded over every fence height and garbage emplacement. The bolt of self-righteous power she always carried was gone, replaced by the weight of real authority. Law enforcement that didn't bend to her whims. The red stains on her hands glistened under the fading sunlight, a damning mark for everyone to see. Neighbors exchanged looks of satisfaction, disbelief, and even quiet relief. For years, Karen had bullied them with rules and fines. Now, she was being held accountable for something far more serious. As the inspector turned back to the crowd, he raised his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. This matter is under federal investigation. Please return to your homes." But no one budged right away. They lingered, whispering, shaking their heads. The legend of Karen's downfall was already being written in their eyes. And I, watching from my porch, felt the heavy irony settle in. Karen thought she was cleaning up the neighborhood, ridding us of so-called clutter. Instead, she had revealed herself as the biggest mess of all, caught red-handed, and now branded for forever. By the time the dye had dried on Karen's hands, the damage was irreversible. She wasn't just a neighborhood nuisance anymore. She was a criminal facing federal charges. The postal inspector made it clear to everyone standing in that cul-de-sac that this wasn't some HOA issue to be handled with a fine or a slap on the wrist. This was mail theft, a felony, the kind of crime that came with heavy penalties. Prison time, fines that would cripple most people, and a permanent stain on her record. The news spread like wildfire. By the following morning, every neighbor who hadn't been there in person had heard the story in detail, some of it exaggerated, most of it true. Kids who saw unfold were already telling their friends at school. Karen got busted by the feds. Adults whispered about it over fences, during dog walks, and at the grocery store. By that evening, someone had already made a meme in the local Facebook group. A photo of a mailbox with the caption, "Karen, keep your hands off." The once powerful HOA enforcer had become a punchline, but Karen's humiliation was only just beginning. The HOA board, which had long tolerated and even quietly benefited from her zeal, scrambled to cut ties immediately. Within 24 hours, an email hit every resident's inbox, written in stiff, formal language. The Homeowners Association does not condone, support, or participate in the unauthorized handling of resident mail. The actions taken by the individual involved in a recent incident were entirely personal and not in any way connected to HOA policies or enforcement. The HOA board was not aware of these actions and distances itself fully from this behavior. In other words, Karen's on her own. It was almost comical, given how often the board had leaned on Karen as their boots on the ground. For years, they had turned a blind eye to her power trips because she saved them the hassle of enforcing the small stuff. She was their attack dog. But now, the dog had bitten off more than it could chew, and they were happy to pretend they'd never encouraged her in the first place. The neighborhood itself was divided between shock and satisfaction. Some residents were embarrassed. "This makes us all look bad," muttered Mr. Lane, once one of her closest allies in enforcing HOA rules. First the Jeep incident down the street, and now this. People are going to think this whole neighborhood's unhinged. Others were quietly relieved. Maybe now we'll finally get some peace, Mrs. Green whispered, her poodle trembling in her arms. She's been policing everyone for years, and it turns out she was the real problem all along. And then there were those who couldn't resist gloating. Teenagers laughed about the red dye stains on her hands, calling her Scarlet Fingers. Someone even taped a note to the mailbox row. Federal property, Karen, do not touch. For once, Karen wasn't issuing the notes. She was the subject of them. As for me, I couldn't help reflecting on the bitter irony. For years, Karen had wielded the HOA handbook like a sword, cutting down anyone who dared violate even the smallest of rules. A lawn too long, a trash bin left out overnight. She was on it, writing complaints, threatening fines, embarrassing people into compliance. But in her obsession with control, she had crossed the one line no one could defend. She hadn't just embarrassed the neighborhood. She had broken the law, federal law, and there was no HOA technicality that could shield her from that. The day after her arrest, I saw her once. She was walking quickly from her house to her car, hood pulled low, sleeves tugged down over her still faintly stained hands. She didn't meet anyone's eyes. For a woman who once strutted around like a sheriff, clipboard in hand, she now moved like a fugitive in her own neighborhood. And that was the final irony. She had always preached that she was protecting the community, keeping things in order, making sure people respected the rules. But in reality, she had been violating one of the most sacred rules of all, the privacy and sanctity of a male. She thought she was untouchable because she had convinced herself that her authority came from the HOA. But authority isn't real if it's self-appointed. Real authority, federal authority, came knocking on her door, and she learned the hard way that her rules meant nothing when stacked against the law. From then on, the dynamic in the neighborhood shifted. People stopped fearing Karen's judgment. No one jumped when she walked by. No one scrambled to mow their lawn a second time that week just to avoid a complaint. She was no longer the enforcer. She was the example. The cautionary tale told in hushed voices over backyard barbecues. Remember when Karen stole the mail? Remember when the postal inspector caught her? The HOA handbook still existed, of course. Rules were still rules. But without Karen to weaponize them, they felt less suffocating, more like guidelines and punishments waiting to happen. The neighborhood breathed easier. As for Karen, she kept a low profile. The once daily patrols of the street stopped entirely. The only time she was seen was when she absolutely had to leave the house. Grocery runs, doctor's appointments, quick errands. She avoided conversations, avoided eye contact, avoided everything. The woman who once made herself the center of attention had become a ghost in her own kingdom. And for me, every time I checked my mailbox, I couldn't help but smirk at the memory of that afternoon. Karen thought she was above the law, that her mission to enforce petty standards gave her more power than anyone else. Instead, she ended up exposed, humiliated, and charged for a crime far greater than any unapproved package she once whined about. For once, the neighborhood didn't need Karen's rules. It had justice. And this time, it was the kind that came not in the form of HOA fines, but in the form of federal law. Imagine this. Your neighbor, the one who constantly nitpicks about the color of your mailbox or the length of your grass, suddenly decides she has the authority to enforce her own rules. That's exactly what happened in my neighborhood when our infamous HOA Karen set her sights on my Jeep. She thought it was an eyesore, claimed it violated community standards, and swore she'd deal with it herself. But here's the twist she didn't see coming. That Jeep wasn't just mine. It belonged to an active police task force, loaded with hidden surveillance equipment. One afternoon, fueled by arrogance and a pair of bolt cutters, Karen marched over, cut my lock, and tried to break into the Jeep. The second she touched that door, alarms and trackers went off. Within minutes, undercover officers swarmed the street. And there she was, caught red-handed, bolt cutters in hand, babbling about HOA rules while facing federal agents. She thought she was enforcing neighborhood policy. Instead, she triggered a police sting. And the fallout? Oh, trust me, it was something the whole neighborhood will never forget. I've always known my neighborhood had a certain reputation. Every lawn is perfectly trimmed, every driveway spotless, and every mailbox lined up like soldiers in uniform. The sidewalks are pressure washed weekly, flower beds rotate with the seasons, and even the holiday decorations are mandated by the HOA rulebook. Around here, the motto is, blend in or be called out. So you can imagine the stir when I parked my Jeep in my driveway one quiet Tuesday afternoon. It wasn't just any Jeep. It was rugged, tall, and armored in a way that didn't match the polished sedans and spotless SUVs scattered across the cul-de-sac. It looked like something that belonged on a military training ground, not in the middle of the suburb where arguments break out over the shade of beige you're allowed to paint your shutters. I noticed the moment I turned off the ignition. The curtains twitching across the street, the disapproving stares from neighbors watering their lawns. The Jeep stood out like a bruise on porcelain. But here's the thing. That Jeep wasn't really mine. Sure, I had the keys. Sure, it was parked in front of my house. But it belonged to a police task force, a specialized undercover unit that had loaned me the vehicle for an operation I was quietly involved in. I wasn't a cop, not officially, but I had ties, and in this case, they needed someone who could keep the Jeep in plain sight without raising suspicion. At least that was the plan. I leaned against the hood that afternoon, feeling the heat of the sun radiating to the black steel. To anyone else, it looked like an old off-road Jeep with some wear and tear. But I knew better. Inside, tucked beneath the dash in hidden compartments, was an array of equipment, tracking devices, cameras, even a mobile uplink connected to a secure line. It was bait in a much larger sting. And my neighborhood, with its polished smiles and secret resentments, was the perfect hiding place. The Jeep had only been there for a few hours when I started hearing the whispers. First, from Mrs. Green, the neighbor 3 doors down who couldn't walk her poodle without broadcasting neighborhood gossip, like a podcast. It doesn't match the aesthetic. I overheard her hissing into her phone. It looks dangerous. Then from Mr. Lane, the self-appointed neighborhood watch captain, who left his garage door open just wide enough for me to see him peering out, binoculars in hand, notebook ready to document whatever crime against property values I had just committed, but none of them compared to her. Karen, every neighborhood has one, but ours had the one, middle-aged, sharp-eyed, with a permanent scowl that made you feel guilty even when you'd done nothing wrong. She was the type who knew every bylaw in the HOA handbook by heart and quoted them like scripture. She had filed complaints against kids for chalk drawings on sidewalks. She had measured lawns with a ruler. She once demanded a neighbor repaint his fence because the shade of white was too warm. And now, she had her eyes locked on my Jeep. I caught her that evening, standing on the edge of her driveway, arms crossed, lips pursed, glaring at it like it had personally insulted her. She marched over once, stopped short, then retreated, muttering something under her breath. I almost laughed. If only she knew what she was glaring at, because that Jeep wasn't just transportation. It was a chess piece in a much bigger game. A police operation designed to monitor certain individuals suspected of running contraband through suburban routes. The task force needed the Jeep visible, but unremarkable. They assumed my quiet, rule-abiding neighborhood would be the perfect cover. No one here asked questions, as long as your roses bloomed on schedule and your garbage cans weren't left out overnight. But the task force hadn't accounted for Karen. That night, as I stood in the kitchen sipping coffee, I caught the faint reflection of flashing lights on the Jeep's interior monitor. The equipment was live, transmitting data back to the unit. I felt a shiver of pride and unease. This was bigger than me. I was a placeholder, a guardian of sorts, keeping the Jeep safe until it served its purpose. I thought about how absurd it would sound to anyone else. Why is there a tactical surveillance Jeep parked in front of a suburban house with tulip beds and garden gnomes? No one could know, not my friends, not my neighbors, and definitely not Karen. But as the days passed, her obsession grew. She circled it in the mornings when she went out to collect her mail. She snapped pictures with her phone, probably emailing them to the HOA board with subject lines like violation report number 237. I even caught her once bending slightly to peek at the lock I had placed on the Jeep, an extra precaution recommended by the task force. She didn't like that lock. Not one bit. I knew what was coming. I could feel it building, like the slow rumble of a storm far off in the distance. With every passing day, Karen's frustration grew until it was no longer about a Jeep or a lock. It was about control. In her mind, the neighborhood was her kingdom, and the Jeep was an intruder she could not tolerate. The irony, of course, was brutal. The more she saw it as a threat to her suburban order, the more she drew closer to a vehicle wired to alert law enforcement at the slightest interference. I remember standing on my porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the rooftops, casting long shadows across the Jeep. I thought about the line between normal life and hidden operations, how thin and fragile it really was. To the neighbors, it was just an ugly Jeep. To Karen, it was a symbol of defiance. To the police task force, it was a tool in a high-stakes game. And to me, it was a secret I had to guard, knowing full well it was only a matter of time before curiosity and arrogance collided and someone got burned. Because Karen wasn't the type to write endless complaint letters and stop there. She was the type to act. And the day she did, she'd have no idea what kind of hornet's nest she was about to crack open. It didn't take long before the paper trail started. The first note appeared on a Wednesday morning, neatly tucked under the Jeep's wiper blade. The handwriting was sharp, deliberate, almost aggressive in its neatness. Every letter pressed like she wanted the ink to stab to the page. Notice of violation. Vehicle lock and overall appearance violate HOA community standards. This Jeep is an eyesore and must be removed immediately. She even underlined immediately. Twice. I plucked it off, folded it in half, and stuffed it in my pocket. My plan was simple. Ignore her. The task force had already warned me that locals might get curious about the Jeep, and the less I engaged, the better. But Karen wasn't the type to stop at one note. The next morning, another appeared. This one had more flair. Your vehicle's external lock is not approved. It looks unsafe, unprofessional, and lowers property values. Failure to comply will result in formal fines. I chuckled as I read it. Unsafe? The irony wasn't lost on me. If she knew what was inside that Jeep, surveillance gear, encrypted uplinks, and federal-grade tracking tech, she wouldn't be worried about the lock. She'd be worried about the fact that tampering with it could put her on a federal watch list. But Karen thrived on imagined authority. She didn't just write notes. She turned them into performances. By the third day, I caught her in the act. Standing in the middle of the street with her phone angled just so, she snapped pictures of the Jeep from every angle, muttering to herself as she circled it like a shark. She crouched to photograph the lock, zoomed in on the tires, even tried to catch reflections through the tinted glass. When she noticed me watching from the porch, she straightened, puffed up her chest, and marched halfway up my driveway. Just so you know, she announced, her voice sharp as broken glass. This vehicle is in violation of Section 4, Subsection C of the HOA Handbook. We do not permit unsightly hardware or unauthorized modifications. I sipped my coffee, deliberately calm. Good morning, Karen. Don't good morning me, she snapped, waving her phone like it was a badge. I've already filed complaint with the HOA board. If this isn't removed, you'll be fined. I wanted to laugh. Fines. If only she knew the kind of fine she was flirting with. Federal, not HOA. But I stayed quiet, nodding like I'd taken her seriously. Because the truth was, the more noise she made, the closer she crept to disaster. By the end of the week, the Jeep had become the neighborhood's favorite spectacle. Kids on bikes whispered about it like it was a monster truck. One boy swore he saw wires glowing inside, which wasn't far from the truth. Retirees walking their dogs shook their heads, muttering that it just didn't belong here. And Karen? She fed off the attention like fuel. Her notes escalated in tone. Last warning. The lock is not permitted. If you do not remove it, further action will be taken. Unsafe vehicle observed again. This will be reported. HOA fines will be enforced. Community safety comes first. Your Jeep compromises it. Each note grew bolder, more dramatic. One even had an attached printout. She had gone home, typed her complaint, and returned to stick it under the wiper like it was a legal summons. The neighbors, however, had grown tired. Karen, it's just a car, muttered Mr. Lane, who usually agreed with her. You're making a scene. Mrs. Green, who adored gossip but hated confrontation, rolled her eyes so hard I thought they'd get stuck. Leave it, Karen. No one cares but you. But that was the problem. When Karen felt ignored, she doubled down. One afternoon, I stepped outside to see her standing only inches from the Jeep, a yellow tape measure stretched across the lock. She scribbled numbers onto a clipboard, shaking her head with exaggerated disapproval. "Illegal dimensions," she muttered loudly, making sure I could hear. This is going straight into the report. I almost asked her what the legal dimensions of a Jeep lock were, but I bit my tongue. Let her play sheriff. The more she pushed, the closer she got to triggering something much bigger than her HOA handbook. The irony was breathtaking. Karen thought she was defending the community from an unsafe lock. In reality, she was circling an active police asset, one wired with alarms and trackers designed to catch criminals in the act of tampering. Every time she touched that Jeep, she was dancing on a tripwire she couldn't see. The neighborhood began to split. Some sided with her, those who feared her wrath more than they cared about the Jeep. "Maybe you should just move it," whispered one nervous neighbor, eyes darting toward Karen's house as if she might be listening. "It's not worth the headache." Others openly mocked her. "What's she gonna do? Write the Jeep a parking ticket?" Laughed a teenager, riding past as Karen photographed the tires for the 5th time. But Karen wasn't laughing. Her face grew tighter, her notes more threatening. She wasn't content with empty warnings anymore. She wanted action, and that was when she crossed the line. It happened on a Friday afternoon, the kind of day when the air feels heavy and restless, like the neighborhood itself is waiting for something to snap. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the cul-de-sac, and most folks had retreated indoors to the hum of air conditioners and the smell of dinner cooking. But not Karen. I noticed her the moment she stepped out of her house. She wasn't carrying her usual clipboard or camera this time. No passive-aggressive notes, no tape measure. Instead, she carried something heavier, something that gleamed under the sunlight, a pair of industrial-sized bolt cutters. The sight was almost surreal. Karen, in her pastel cardigan and sensible sneakers, striding down her driveway like a soldier going to war, muttering under her breath as she marched toward the Jeep. "This neighborhood has standards," she hissed, "and I'm not going to let one selfish person ruin it for everyone." Her words carried in the quiet evening. The few neighbors who happened to be outside froze, unsure if they should intervene or just watch the spectacle unfold. Mrs. Green clutched her poodle tighter, whispering, "Oh, dear Lord," while Mr. Lane peeked out from his garage, scribbling something in his notebook. Karen didn't care. She was on a mission. I watched from my front window, my heart pounding. The task force had warned me about interference, but even they hadn't predicted this level of audacity. She wasn't just filing complaints anymore. She was about to physically tamper with an active undercover vehicle. She reached the Jeep, planted her feet wide, and positioned the bolt cutters against the thick steel lock I'd secured to the driver's side. Her face was twisted in determination, lips pursed, brows furrowed, sweat beading at her temples. With a grunt, she clamped down. Snap! The lock gave way with a metallic crack, falling to the driveway with a heavy clang that echoed through the street. It was the sound of a boundary shattering, the invisible line between petty HOA meddling and real crime. Karen didn't flinch. She tossed the broken lock aside like trash and grabbed the Jeep's handle. "Time to clean up this mess," she declared, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "We'll have this thing towed before sundown." But the second she yanked the door open, the Jeep awakened. It started subtle. A faint click beneath the dashboard, a tiny red light blinking alive on the console. Then came the surge of sound, a sharp, piercing alarm that split the suburban quiet like a siren at crime scene. Hidden trackers inside the Jeep lit up simultaneously, sending encrypted signals racing across invisible networks to the task force command center miles away. Karen stumbled back, startled, but not enough to stop her. "What on earth?" she muttered, covering her ears against the shrill alarm. The neighbors gasped. Curtains fluttered as more faces appeared in windows. Children ran from their bikes to their porches. The quiet cul-de-sac had transformed into a stage, and Karen was center spotlight, bolt cutter still dangling from her hand. And the show wasn't over. Within moments, the alarm triggered a cascade of responses. The Jeep's headlights flashed wildly, horn blaring in bursts, while the internal uplink relayed a simple but urgent message to the task force. Vehicle tampered. Send units immediately. I could almost imagine the officers on the other end springing into action, radios crackling, agents suiting up, unmarked vehicles roaring to life. Karen, meanwhile, was flustered but still defiant. She shoved the door again, shouting over the alarm. This vehicle is unsafe. It doesn't belong here. I'm doing everyone a favor. Her words sounded hollow now, drowned out by the shriek of alarms and the growing murmur of neighbors gathering at a distance. Nobody moved to support her. Even those who once nodded at her crusades were now backing away, eyes wide. It didn't take long. 5 minutes, maybe less. That's all the task force needed. The first black SUV tore into the neighborhood like thunder, tires screeching as it stopped directly behind the Jeep. Then another, and another. Within moments, the peaceful cul-de-sac was crawling with undercover agents spilling out of vehicles, guns holstered but hands ready, tactical vests glinting with federal insignia. Karen froze, bolt cutters still in her grip, her face drained of color as 2 officers closed in on her, their voices firm and authoritative. Step away from the vehicle, ma'am. Drop the cutters. I what? No, this is a violation of HOA rules. Karen stammered, waving the cutters in protest. This car was locked illegally. I was correcting the problem. The agents exchanged a look, half disbelief, half irritation. Ma'am, one said slowly, you've just tampered with a federal task force vehicle. This is a criminal offense. The words hit like a sledgehammer. The neighbors gasped audibly. Mrs. Green covered her mouth. Mr. Lane's pen fell from his notebook. Karen, however, doubled down. No, you don't understand. This is my neighborhood. I enforce the rules here. That Jeep was unsafe. I was protecting the community. The officer didn't blink. Ma'am, put the cutters down. Now. Her hands trembled. The bolt cutters slipped from her grasp and clattered onto the pavement. For the first time since I'd known her, Karen looked small, deflated, cornered, powerless. The agents moved in, securing the Jeep, scanning its equipment, confirming the alarm logs. Others questioned me, confirming I was a registered caretaker of the vehicle. And all the while, Karen stood surrounded, sputtering excuses that no one wanted to hear. HOA rules don't override federal law. One officer finally told her, his voice low and final. It was over. In less than 10 minutes. Karen had transformed from self-appointed enforcer of petty neighborhood laws to a suspect caught tampering with federal property. And the fallout was only just beginning. The street had never seen anything like it. One moment, the quiet of the cul-de-sac was broken only by the shrill wail of the Jeep's hidden alarm. The next, it was chaos. Black SUVs with tinted windows screeching to a halt, tires leaving fresh rubber streaks across the pristine pavement. Doors flew open and out poured men and women in tactical vests, radios crackling, hands resting near their sidearms. The neighbors poured out like moths to a flame. Curtains were yanked aside, porches filled with gawkers, cell phones lifted high to record what would soon be the most talked-about moment in the history of their HOA. And in the center of it all stood Karen. Her pastel cardigan looked almost comical against the backdrop of armored agents. She still clutched the bolt cutters in one hand, knuckles white, face frozen between outrage and panic. The broken lock lay at her feet like damning evidence. 2 officers advanced quickly, their movements sharp but controlled. One barked in a voice that cut through the noise. Ma'am, drop the cutters. Step away from the vehicle. Now. Karen blinked, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. She looked down at the bolt cutters, then back at the Jeep, as if only now realizing she was caught in something far bigger than an HOA violation. I what? No, you don't understand, she sputtered, her voice cracking. This Jeep was illegally parked. It violated community standards. I was... Ma'am. The officer's tone hardened. You are interfering with federal property. Put the cutters down. The words federal property rippled through the crowd, like a shockwave. Neighbors gasped. Whispers exploded into frantic chatter. Mrs. Green nearly dropped her poodle. Mr. Lane's notebook slipped from his hands. Even the teenagers who had been smirking at Karen's antics earlier fell silent, eyes wide as they recorded every second on their phones. Karen's jaw trembled. She loosened her grip, and the bolt cutters clattered loudly against the driveway. "Good," the officer said, signaling another agent to move in. "Step back with your hands where we can see them." Karen complied, stiff and jerky, her arms raised awkwardly above her shoulders. Her eyes darted to crowded neighbors, as if searching for sympathy, but all she saw were wide eyes and shaking heads. "Please," she tried again, desperation bleeding into her voice. "I was only enforcing the rules. This vehicle had an unauthorized lock. It was lowering property values, and—" "Ma'am," the second officer interrupted firmly, "you just committed a felony. This isn't about property values. This is an active task force operation." Her knees seemed to buckle slightly. "Task force? But it's just a Jeep. It's ugly. It doesn't belong here." From the back of the crowd, someone finally shouted what everyone else was thinking. "It doesn't belong here? Neither do bolt cutters, Karen." Laughter rippled through the audience, sharp and unforgiving. Karen's face flushed red, then pale, then red again. She tried to recover her composure. "You don't understand. The HOA handbook clearly states—" "Ma'am." The officer cut her off with a tone of finality. "HOA rules don't override federal law. You've tampered with government property. That's a serious crime." The weight of the words seemed to crush her. For years, Karen had thrived on being the self-appointed enforcer of petty rules. But in this moment, her power evaporated. She wasn't the hunter anymore. She was prey, cornered under the unblinking eyes of the entire neighborhood. The agents moved past her, swarming the Jeep. They checked the equipment, scanned the hidden trackers, logged the alarm trigger. Radios crackled with confirmation. The system had worked exactly as designed. The bait had been tampered with, and the response had been immediate. Meanwhile, 2 officers remained with Karen, keeping her from bolting back to her house. She stood frozen, muttering weak protests. "This is all a misunderstanding. I was protecting the neighborhood. The lock was unsafe." Her excuses grew smaller with each attempt. The more she spoke, the more absurd she sounded, especially against a backdrop of flashing tactical gear and federal agents. The neighbors whispered mercilessly. "Can you believe this? She thought she could tow a federal Jeep. I told you she'd go too far one day. Unbelievable. All that over a lock." I stayed silent on my porch, coffee mug trembling slightly in my hand. Part of me wanted to step in to explain, but the task force had been clear. "Stay out of it. Let's handle it." So I watched as Karen's world unraveled in front of everyone. Finally, one officer addressed the gathering crowd, his voice amplified with authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your homes. This is an active federal matter. There is no danger to the public at this time." But no one moved. Phones continued recording. Eyes continued staring. For once, Karen wasn't the one doing the shaming. She was the one being publicly dismantled. "Please," she cried suddenly, turning to the officer nearest her. "You don't understand. I was only trying to enforce orders. Without rules, there's chaos." The officer gave her a long, measured look. "Ma'am, the only chaos here is the one you created." The words landed like a gavel. Karen's shoulders slumped, her head bowed. The bolt cutters lay at her feet, the broken lock beside them. Symbols of arrogance and downfall. It was almost poetic. For years, she had claimed to protect the neighborhood. But in the end, it wasn't vandals or burglars or strangers she had exposed. It was herself, and the neighborhood would never forget it. The aftermath was swift, public, and unforgettable. Within hours of the incident, Karen's carefully cultivated image of authority collapsed like a house of cards. Federal officers didn't just let her off with a warning. They processed her right there in the middle of the cul-de-sac. The neighbors watched in stunned silence as she was questioned, her statements scribbled down, her excuses cataloged, and her face photographed for the official report. The charges were serious. Property damage, tampering with police equipment, and obstruction of justice. Even the phrasing sounded like a hammer dropping. It was more than a slap on the wrist. It was a kind of list that followed you into courtrooms, employment background checks, and whispered conversations in grocery stores. Karen sputtered through every step, her voice shaking, desperate to spin the story back into her favor. This is a misunderstanding. I was following HOA rules. I was trying to protect the community. But her protest sounded thin, hollow, and pathetic against the weight of the law. The officers were polite, but unyielding. No one was interested in the HOA handbook anymore. By the next morning, the whole neighborhood knew. Word spread faster than the alarm had. Phones buzzed, social media posts circulated, and even local news stations caught wind of the story. HOA resident caught tampering with federal vehicle was the kind of headline that practically wrote itself. The HOA board scrambled to distance themselves. They released a stiffly worded statement, printed in all caps on the community bulletin, and emailed to every resident. The board of directors does not condone nor support the individual actions of residents who interfere with property not belonging to them. The HOA had no knowledge of nor involvement in the incident that occurred on date. In plain English, they had thrown Karen to the wolves. For years, they had tolerated her self-appointed crusades because she saved them the effort of enforcing petty rules. But now, she was toxic, an embarrassment too big to sweep under the rug. The community itself was a mixture of relief, disbelief, and glee. Mrs. Green, clutching her poodle on her morning walk, muttered, "I always knew she'd take it too far." Mr. Lane, usually her ally, shook his head as he watered his lawn. She thought she was above everyone else. Turns out, she's not even above the law. The teenagers were less diplomatic. They circulated memes of Karen wielding bolt cutters, superimposed with captions like Karen versus the feds, round one. Even the more sympathetic neighbors couldn't resist gossiping. Did you hear? They said the Jeep was part of the sting operation. Federal property. Can you imagine? She's lucky she didn't end up in handcuffs on the evening news. I stayed quiet, as instructed by the task force. My role had been small, just a caretaker of the Jeep, but now I felt like a witness to a morality play. Watching Karen unravel was almost surreal. She had always carried herself like a queen among peasants, wielding HOA rules like a sword. But now she was dethroned, exposed, and powerless. The irony wasn't lost on me. She thought she was defending the community from a lock, a Jeep, a minor violation. But in reality, she had stumbled headfirst into a federal operation, her arrogance turning a simple nuisance into a criminal case. She hadn't been protecting the neighborhood. She had endangered it. For weeks afterward, Karen all but vanished. The woman who once patrolled the sidewalks with her clipboard was suddenly nowhere to be seen. No more notes tucked under windshield wipers. No more pictures snapped from across the street. No more loud arguments about the shade of someone's shutters. When she did appear, she was smaller somehow. Shoulders hunched, eyes cast downward, always in a hurry to scuttle back inside before anyone could stop her. If she passed someone on the street, she avoided eye contact. Gone was the piercing glare that once made children drop their sidewalk chalk. And the Jeep? It remained exactly where it was, parked in my driveway, humming quietly with its hidden equipment. Karen never so much as glanced at it again. The neighborhood learned something, too. For years, people had tolerated Karen because it was easier than fighting her, easier to repaint the fence than argue, easier to mow the lawn twice a week than receive endless violation notices. But now, the spell was broken. She wasn't the enforcer anymore. She wasn't untouchable. She was just another neighbor, one who had been humiliated in front of everyone. And every time I walked past a Jeep, I couldn't help but smile at the thought. Karen had wanted to enforce order, but in doing so, she had exposed the fragility of her own authority. The Jeep stayed until the task force declared the operation complete. One morning, the same SUVs returned, quiet this time, efficient. The Jeep was driven away without fanfare, its mission accomplished. For the neighbors, it was just a mysterious vehicle that came and went.